Thank you. I'm a latecomer to this party. I was sitting listening to Nigel earlier and reflecting that I've now been in this party for 17 months. He's coming up to 17 years since he broke into the European Parliament, and he and many of you have been on a long march for several years longer still. We now have that referendum. I would ask you to take just a moment to reflect on your achievement. Getting from the foundation of this party, I think now 23 or so years ago, to actually getting that in our referendum. It is an extraordinary achievement, and I think really every one of you in this hall should just reflect on what you have achieved in getting us to this point. Reflect, however, for no more than a moment, because we then have to go out and win that referendum. And to do so is going to mean working with people beyond this hall, working with people beyond this party. Now, in the Labour Party, I don't think we hope to get any more than a dozen or two at best members of Parliament on our side. But we have, within the wider Labour movement, within trade unions and Labour people out in the country, actually a significant degree of support, which is going to be very, very important to constructing that majority of 50% plus one. Now, as we look to find that 50% plus one, a less important area for us to prospect is the Liberal Democrat vote, which is much reduced. But even in that tradition, there is still a continuing Liberal Party which decided against that merger with the Liberal Democrats. And I understand that the Liberal Party position is one of supporting withdrawal from the European Union, as now is the position of David Owen. And we must also work with Conservatives. And the news from that section of the political front has been really very good since Cameron's vaunted renegotiation. We were told perhaps the best we could hope for was 70 Conservative MPs. Yet now we have, I think, at least 130 Conservative MPs. And we have the overwhelming majority of Conservative activists out in the country. And if we are to win this referendum, not only do we need every single person, basically, who voted UKIP at the last election, but we are going to need half as many again, perhaps almost twice as many again, who voted for the Conservative Party to come and to put their pencil with ours into that leave box on the referendum. My whole adult life, I believe we should leave the European Union. And I believe that for 25 years as Conservative and 17 months now with UKIP. But that has been my political lodestar throughout that time, that belief that we are more than a star on somebody else's flag. My belief that we should be an independent country, trading with Europe, but governing ourselves. And the reason I believe in our independence as a nation is not because I am a nationalist, but because I am a Democrat. I'm also an economist. And that's why I speak to you on the economy today, and why I also believe we should leave the European Union, because we would be better off out. My first job was, after graduating from university, I was UK economist for S.G. Warburg, a name that may be familiar to a few, if not a great number of you. But in that role as an economist, those who want to paint a disobliging picture of me say instead that I was a banker. And I then started a tour through some of the most unpopular professions. Next, I was a management consultant. I then became a lawyer. And finally, well, I don't know, for now at least, a politician. All I can say is just as well I've never been an estate agent. But speaking to you as our economy spokesperson, what I most want to address is a theme that was the major economic issue perhaps of the 1980s, at least in the United States, and that was one of twin deficits. We have not just a very large budget deficit that has been running for many, many years at a very, very high level, but we also have a very large current account deficit. So one is how much the government is borrowing, the other is how much the country is borrowing. And I believe the most important economic task we face is to close those deficits, to deal with them. And I believe we can only do that through leaving the European Union and again making our own independent decisions. The amount we pay into the European Union, the 55 million a day or the 350 million or so a week or the 20 billion odd a year, however you put it, that is money that we are borrowing in order, frankly, to give away to the European Union. And yeah, we get a few things back, but when I pay my council tax, I don't say, oh, well, £1,500, that's the cost of it. I don't say, oh, well, actually, it's less than that because they empty my bins in return. And neither should we say, oh, it's 20 billion, but, oh, let's just look at the 10 or 11 billion net after they spend all this money on things we wouldn't choose ourselves. And yes, we do get a bit of a rebate, and they do spend some of that money in the UK, but not on the things we would choose to. And that 20 billion is money that we have to find, and the 11 billion is a very significant sum that's added to our deficit every year, both as for the government and for the nation as a whole. So I believe we have to leave the European Union in order to close those deficits, save some of that money that the government is borrowing, but also save some of that money that the country is borrowing. And there's not just the 11 billion a year we give in government money to the European Union. And that ignores many of the indirect costs. For instance, all that time that UK civil servants are spending actually working on European Union matters, that's not included. What about all the extra money we spend for every hospital, every school, every prison meal that the government pays for at inflated EU prices rather than on world market prices? That isn't included either. We then, as well as our EU contribution, we spend even more than that every year on overseas aid. Again, it's money we have to borrow in order to give away. Now, after me, the wonderful William Dartmouth, our new deputy chairman, is going to explain to you about trade and how our country has been harmed by that diversion of our natural patterns of trade and that bias in favour of the European Union and against the outside world. But another area where that's happened is something called our investment balance. And that's basically the flow of money from investments. UK investments overseas, where we get money coming back each year, but also overseas investments in the UK, where we have to pay money out to them every year. That deficit of the current account deficit is between 4 and 6% of GDP. And partly that's the money we pay out as a government, but also it's the money we're losing on investments because of that diversion of our balance of trade. And David Cameron tells us that in order to fund this big deficit, in order to persuade foreigners to keep sort of lending us all the money, it's essential that we stay in the European Union. That's what he says. But how sustainable is that position of borrowing 5% of everything we earn as a country every year? And in order to fund that, the only ways to do it is we either borrow that money from overseas or we sell assets to foreigners in order to bridge that gap. So when I hear people complain about all these empty flats and luxury development in London that's bought by people who live overseas. Now, some of it is rented out to people here, some isn't. But the money that is coming in to pay for those from overseas is basically a significant part of that money that we need to borrow as a country every year because we have this massive deficit. So it is a symptom and not a cause. We also hear the Prime Minister and others, they refer to what's happening to the level of the pound, as if somehow it's some terribly bad thing that our currency should become more competitive. They want to keep us in the European Union in order to keep financing that deficit, and they speak as if it's a self-evidently good thing that the pound must always be higher rather than lower, rather than it being a good thing to have a market mechanism that allows our economy to work. Now, what we've seen with the level of the currency, when the pound falls, it's actually good for exporters from this country, actually for our farmers, for people who sell overseas. They're more able to do so, and they earn more money when they do sell. Another area where it is good is what happens to our investment income, the amount of money we earn from overseas every year. Over 3/4 of the earnings of the top 100 companies registered in this country are earned overseas. So when we have a lower pound, those overseas earnings automatically translate through into higher income for the people here who own those shares. So people who are pensioners, who are reliant on some of those big companies for their dividends, a lower pound means they're actually getting more pounds in their pocket because of that income. We also have, in that market mechanism of a floating currency, and it's just so important that we held on to this, the idea of trying to leave the European Union were we locked into the euro, it would be a much more difficult thing than that decision I hope our nation will make on June the 23rd. Because if there is risk, if there is uncertainty, and we are choosing between two different futures, what we see is that that more competitive exchange rate allows us to sell more overseas, allows us to get more income, it compensates any investor who may be concerned about uncertainty, and it allows that market to balance. And that is incredibly important. So when they do their Project Fear, when they say, oh, well, look, the pound's weak, oh, it's all because Boris has come out for Brexit, or we might become independent again. Actually, at the same time, you don't see the stock market fall. Many of those companies, they benefit from the lower pound. As do our exporters, and as often do our pensioners and people who are dependent on dividend income. Now, there's one other way in which the European Union and that investment balance is working to harm our country and undermine our ability to earn our living. And that is the advertised theme of my speech today: getting companies to pay their taxes. Perhaps the major reason why it is so difficult to do that is the European Union. I'll go through, if I may, just two ways in which the European Union is basically the tax avoider's friend. Now, one of those is something that they call in the European Union freedom of establishment. It's this idea that you can incorporate anywhere you like in 27 countries of the European Union, or is it 28, and that you can then sell within it. But also what it means in terms of how it's interpreted is that companies can choose a country where there is a low tax rate or where they can come up with some special deal for their company, and they can use that as a base and have their European income taxed there, even if it is in reality earned elsewhere. So the Chancellor has what he claimed was a great success of making Google pay £130 million in cumulative back taxes over a number of years. Now, the French are demanding 10 times as much. But George Osborne thinks that's this great success, but he hasn't even challenged the fundamental basis that companies can use to avoid tax in this country. And that is by purporting to operate in this country through being a branch of another country, by denying that they have a permanent establishment in the United Kingdom. And that is how Google is able to say that its income, often made by selling advertisements from people in the UK to people in the UK that are watched in the UK, actually that is booked in Ireland, and it's a matter for the Irish tax authorities, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, George Osborne claimed that he was going to have this diverted profits tax, and that was going to allow him to deal with this. And it was christened a Google tax. Yet in this instance, he hasn't even used it. Now, the other key way in which companies can avoid their taxes was illustrated in a rather lovely program I saw perhaps about 3 weeks ago now. I don't know if any of you saw it, but it focused on a beautiful Welsh town between Brecon and Abergavenny called Crickhowell. And what they did in Crickhowell is the small traders, and it has, those of you who haven't been, I would encourage you to visit, has the most beautiful selection of sort of independent shops and a very, very vibrant sort of local economy. And they thought, actually, what we've got is something really special in Crickhowell. And we can say this is the intellectual property of Crickhowell. And part of it is that we have all these independent small businesses. And part of it is a belief in fairness, that people should pay their fair share, but no more, and that we should protect our locality. So what they did is they incorporated that intellectual property into a company, and they registered it in the Isle of Man. And then each of those independent shops that own part of that company, instead of declaring their profits to the taxman and paying tax on them, they could use some of those profits to pay a license fee to this Crickhowell intellectual property company based in the Isle of Man, send the license fee there, therefore reduce their taxable profits and pay less tax. However, as described, the structure didn't quite work because HMRC, the taxman, saw them coming and said, well, if you just give intellectual property payments out to a tax haven, then we will have a 25% withholding tax on any money that you pay out. Unfortunately, there's a way around it. And the reason there's a way around it is because of the European Union. And because in the European Union, there is free movement of capital, and you're not allowed to apply a withholding tax against other countries in the European Union. So what the Crickhowell shopholders did, and all best of luck to them, but perhaps not to the larger companies who do it, is they set up a subsidiary, a separate company in Holland. And what they did is instead of paying their royalty payments direct to the Isle of Man, they paid them to their company in Holland, and then Holland, which doesn't have a withholding tax with tax havens, then pays the money on to the company in the Isle of Man. And it's through that mechanism that corporates can avoid paying their fair share of taxes. So what I say is we need to leave the European Union, we need to deal with this abuse of freedom of establishment, deal with this abuse of freedom of movement of capital, and make those companies pay their taxes. And once they pay their taxes, we'll be giving less investment income overseas, we'll be closing our current account deficit, we'll be paying our way better as a nation, and we will be better off out. By a certain serendipity, that's 17 years since Nigel broke into the European Parliament, that's 17 months since I joined this party, between now and the referendum is 17 weeks. Let's get out and win it.